The transformation that defines Unit 4 does not begin with law or protest. It begins with a deeper question. Who gets to define what Black identity is? Because for centuries, that definition had been imposed. From colonial systems to racial hierarchies, from intellectual traditions that positioned African-descended people as outside of modernity, outside of civilization, outside of history itself. So in the early 20th century, it becomes a turning point, not simply because Black artists begin creating, but because they begin reframing. Movements like the New Negro movement in the United States, alongside its twins, Negritude and Negrismo in the Caribbean and Latin America, emerge as intellectual responses to that imposed identity. But what makes these movements so unique and significant is not just that they reject European frameworks, they replace them entirely. They build new ways of understanding and defining Blackness that are rooted in history, culture, and continuity. You see this clearly in Louise Malou Jones's Les Fétiches. The masks that are in the painting are not presented as artifacts of a distant past. They are centered, elevated, and authoritative. The painting insists that African cultural forms are not primitive, they're foundational. Wilfredo Lamb's The Jungle complicates this even further. The distorted figures reflect the violence of plantation economies, but they also reveal something else: survival. Afro-Caribbean spiritual traditions persists within systems designed to erase them. The painting holds both realities at once: oppression and continuity. And then there's Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism. Césaire does not simply critique colonialism, he dismantles its logic. He argues that colonialism is not a civilizing force, but a system that produces violence, exploitation, destruction, and moral decay. What all of these works share is a shift in perspective. Black identity is no longer being interpreted, it's being theorized, defined, asserted. And once that shift happens, it does not stay contained within culture, it moves. Because once people begin to redefine who they are, they also begin to redefine what freedom should look like. By the mid-20th century, this cultural redefinition intersects with global political change. Across Africa and the Caribbean, colonial systems are being dismantled. Nations that have been controlled for generations are asserting their independence, and African Americans are watching, not from a distance, but with recognition, because the structures of colonialism abroad and racial hierarchy at home are not separate systems, they're connected. And this is where the idea of diaspora shifts from identity to strategy. When Martin Luther King Jr. travels to Ghana in 1957, he's witnessing more than just African independence. He's witnessing a reordering of power. A formerly colonized nation is defining itself on its own terms. And that moment carries implications back to the United States. Influenced by thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, who had long argued for global Black solidarity, this becomes a turning point in how African Americans understand their own struggle. It's no longer just a fight for civil rights within the United States. It's a part of a broader movement to dismantle systems of domination across the world. So what begins as cultural reclamation becomes political alignment. And that alignment raises a new question. If the United States claims to represent freedom globally, what does that mean for the people it excludes domestically? That question becomes unavoidable during World War II. The United States positions itself as a defender of democracy, fighting against fascism, authoritarianism, and against racial ideologies abroad. But for African Americans, that message is complicated by lived experience. Because while democracy is being defended overseas, it's being denied at home. The Double V for Victory campaign, articulated by James G. Thompson, captures this contradiction directly. Victory against fascism abroad must be matched by victory against racism at home, and African Americans step forward to claim both. The Tuskegee Airmen demonstrate excellence in this combat, challenging assumptions about Black ability. The 6,888th Battalion, led by Major Charity Adams, manages an overwhelming backlog of military mail, restoring communication systems critical to troop morale and coordination. These Black women are not symbolic contributions, they're essential. And yet, when the war ends, equality does not follow. And this is where the GI Bill becomes critical. On paper, it expands access to education, home ownership, to economic mobility, but in practice, these benefits are distributed through local systems and banks, universities, and housing authorities that often exclude Black veterans. So while the GI Bill on the federal level gave Black people what they needed, local municipalities denied them. So what appears to be a moment of opportunity becomes a moment of divergence. While veterans gain access to wealth-building pathways, Black veterans are systematically limited. And that reveals something fundamental. Inequality is not simply about exclusion, it's about how systems distribute opportunity. And it is precisely that realization that gives rise to the Civil Rights Movement. But this movement is not unified around a single strategy. It develops across multiple fronts: legal, political, and grassroots. The legal strategy began in the South, led by the NAACP, focuses on dismantling segregation through the courts. This approach is methodical, it's incremental. It begins in the 1940s strategically, and it culminates in the 1950s by Brown v. Board of Education. But what makes Brown significant is not just the decision, it's the evidence behind it. You see, Kenneth and Mamie Clark's doll test, documented by filmmaker Gordon Parks, reveals the psychological effects of segregation. Black children, when asked to choose between one white doll and one black doll, associate whiteness with goodness and blackness with inferiority. This is not about preference, it's about conditioning. And it shows that segregation is not just a legal system, it's a system that shapes identity itself. But even as Brown dismantles legal segregation, inequality persists. Housing discrimination through redlining restricts where people can live and what schools that they can attend and what wealth they can accumulate. Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun captures this reality, showing how structural inequality shapes family decisions, aspirations, and limitations. So legal change creates possibility, but not equality, which is why protest becomes necessary. In Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait, he explains that waiting for gradual change is not neutral. It sustains injustice. Direct action is designed to create tension, to force confrontation, and to make inequality visible. The photograph by Danny Lyon revealed activists kneeling in prayer at segregated pools. This captures the discipline of nonviolence. You see, nonviolence isn't passive, it's deliberate, it's strategic, and the writings of John Lewis reinforce this idea that nonviolence is not simply a moral act, but a tactical one. It exposes the brutality of the system by refusing to mirror it, to reproduce it. So campaigns like Birmingham, the March on Washington, Freedom Marches, and Summers expand this strategy. They shift the movement from local to national, from isolated to incidents, to sustained pressure. And that pressure produces results. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 represent major legislative victories, but they also reveal something else: that change requires not an argument, but disruption. And yet, even in the face of these victories, something becomes clear. Legal equality does not eliminate inequality. Access does not guarantee control, and inclusion does not necessarily produce power, which is why the movement does not end. It evolves. And as the civil rights movement expands to begin to produce visible victory, something else begins to emerge alongside that progress: disagreement. Because success does not resolve tension, it reveals it. It reveals differences in how people understand leadership, strategy, and even the very definition of freedom itself. This is where women like Ella Baker become essential. Baker challenges the idea that movements should be driven by singular, charismatic, male leaders. Instead, she argues for a model rooted in participatory democracy, one in which ordinary people are not just participants, but decision makers. That philosophy reshapes organizations like the one she led, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where leadership is intentionally decentralized. The goal is not simply to win rights, it's to build political capacity within communities. And at the same time she's doing that, Fannie Lou Haber emerges in Mississippi as a different form of authority, one grounded not in formal leadership, but in lived grassroots experience in life. When Haber speaks about being denied the right to vote, about being beaten, about the daily realities of exclusion, she forces a confrontation with a critical truth. Legal victories do not automatically translate into lived equality. And then there are the internal critiques. The SNCC position paper on women exposes a contradiction within the movement itself. You see, even as activists fight for racial justice, gender inequality persists within their own organizations. That document does more than critique, it expands the scope of what justice must include. And at the same time, culture is doing the work that formal political structures cannot fully contain. Nicholas Guillen's poetry connects Black struggles in the United States to those in the Caribbean, reinforcing the idea that these are a part of a shared diaspora experience. Charlie Mingus, the jazz bassist, Fables of Fabus, does something equally powerful. It names political resistance to integration, and it critiques it directly through his art, through his music, transforming performance into protest. And freedom songs rooted in spiritual traditions serve not as just expressions of faith, but as tools of coordination, memory, and resilience. They unify protesters, they sustain morale, and they transform fear into collective strength. So by this point, the movement is no longer defined solely by its opposition to segregation. It's defined by an expanding understanding of power, who holds it, how it operates, and how it must be transformed. It is precisely that question, how power operates, that drives the next shift. By the mid-1960s, many activists began to question whether integration alone is sufficient. If access to institutions does not guarantee control over resources, decision-making, or community outcomes, then what does freedom actually require? This is where Malcolm X becomes central, not just as an individual, but as a framework for rethinking the struggle. You see, Malcolm X challenges the assumption that equality must come through acceptance into existing systems. Instead, he emphasizes the self-determination, the ability of Black communities to define their own political, economic, and cultural futures. That shift is visible in the circulation of Muhammad Speaks, a newspaper which functions more than simply a piece of literature, creates an alternative public sphere, one in which Black political thought is produced and circulated independently. Images of Elijah Muhammad addressing audiences reinforce the structure of this alternative system, organized, disciplined, and ideologically grounded. This particular ideology emerged in the Black Panther Party, Black nationalists. You see, the Black Panther Party extends this framework into practice. Their 10-point program outlines specific demands: housing, education, employment, justice, framing them not as simply requests, but as rights. But what makes the Panthers particularly significant is their focus in what they would call survival programs. You see, the free breakfast program by the Black Panther Party is not symbolic, it's material. It addresses immediate needs while simultaneously exposing the failure of the state to do so. In this way, the Panthers are not just protesting inequality, they're building alternatives to it. They're critiquing the system not simply from its social and political paradigms, but their economic realities. So the shift to Black power is not simply about militancy or rhetoric. It's about redefining power as something that must be built, controlled, and sustained within the community. And at the same time that political strategies are shifting, something equally significant is happening within Black culture. You see, identity is no longer being negotiated quietly, it's being asserted publicly, visibly, and unapologetically. Elizabeth Caitlet's Negroes as Bellows captures the shift visually. The image centers Black identities not as marginal, but as powerful and self-defined. You see, the phrase "Black is beautiful" is a direct challenge to centuries of imposed inferiority. When Black Panther leader Kathleen Cleaver extends this into everyday life, she speaks about her natural hair, her afro, as she reframes appearance as a political statement. Her hair becomes a site of resistance, a rejection of Eurocentric standards, and as an affirmation of African heritage. And then there's Maya Angelou. In Still I Rise, she transforms historical weight, slavery, exclusion, violence into assertion. In her poetry, she reveals the repetition of rhythm and the structure of her poem all function as performance. It's not just a statement of survival, it is a declaration of self-definition. Movements like Black is Beautiful and Afrocentricity build on these ideas, centering African heritage as a source of pride and identity. But they also introduce new questions. Whose version of identity is being centered, and how do we account for difference within the diaspora? So even within cultural affirmation, there's debate, and that debate reflects a deeper truth. Identity is not a fixed reality. It's constructed, contested, and continually defined and redefined over and over again. So as these debates unfold, activists begin to recognize that oppression cannot be understood through a single lens. The Combahee River Collective Statement marks a turning point because it names this complexity directly. It argues that systems of oppression, race, class, gender, and sexuality do not operate independently. They intersect, shaping living experiences that cannot be reduced into a single category. This is not simply a theoretical one. It's grounded in the experiences of Black women who find themselves marginalized, not only within society at large, but within movements themselves for racial, sexual, and gender justice. The statement challenges movements to expand and to recognize that liberation must be inclusive, or it is incomplete. Gwendolyn Brooks' Maud Martha reflects this shift in a different way. Rather than focusing on large-scale political events, it examines the everyday, how identity is experienced, negotiated, and internalized in everyday Black life. And that is the shift. Freedom is no longer defined only by laws or policies. It is defined by lived experience, by dignity, by recognition. And as these movements reshape American society, they produce real change, but they also reveal the limits of change. Political representation expands. Barriers that once seemed insurmountable begin to shift. A Black middle class grows supported by new access to education and employment. But at the same time, structural inequality persists. Wealth gaps remain significant, shaped by earlier policies such as redlining and unequal access to housing and education. These disparities are not accidental, they're cumulative. They reflect decisions made across decades that continue to shape opportunity in the present. And what this moment reveals is that progress is not linear, it's uneven, it's layered, it's incomplete, and it raises a critical and essential question. What does equality mean if the structures that produce inequality remain in its place? As the struggle evolves, it moves into new arenas, spaces that were not traditionally considered political. In 1968, Tommie Smith and John Carlos stand on an Olympic podium and raise their fists during the national anthem. That gesture is brief, but its impact is global. It transforms a sporting event into a political statement, demonstrating that visibility itself can be a form of protest. And decades later, in that same spirit, Colin Kaepernick kneels during the national anthem, drawing attention to police violence at an NFL football game. The response, the support, the backlash, the debate, the fissure reveals that tensions of earlier movements have not disappeared. They've simply shifted context. And in science and medicine, the story is equally complex. Katherine Johnson plays a critical role in space exploration, calculating trajectories that make NASA missions possible. Her work challenges assumptions about who belongs in scientific spaces. At the same time, the story of Henrietta Lacks raises ethical questions about consent, ownership, and exploitation. Her cells contribute to major medical advancements, but they are taken without her knowledge or permission, revealing ethical dilemmas amongst racial realities. So in moments of progress, inequality persists. And that is a pattern that defines this period: expansion without resolution, opportunity alongside exclusion, and recognition alongside exploitation. And though all of these shifts through law, protest, policy, and identity, one thread remains constant. Black cultural expression does not disappear, it adapts. So by the 1970s, that adaptation takes shape in a very specific place: the Bronx, New York. And the conditions matter. You see, this is a moment in the 1970s defined by deindustrialization, white flight, disinvestment, and the collapse of urban structure, which brings about violence. Buildings are abandoned, schools are underfunded, public resources are stripped away. But what emerges in that environment is not silence, it's creation. Hip-hop, music, and culture develops not as a product of abundance, but as a response to absence. And yet what it produces, anything but lacking. It draws on older traditions in African and African American and Caribbean traditions that have been around for centuries. Call and response becomes the interaction between the MC and the crowd. Improvisation becomes freestyle and breakdancing, and rhythm becomes the foundation of the breakbeat and DJing. And storytelling becomes lyrical narrative rooted in lived experiences that we call rap. The DJ isolating the break is not just playing the music, he's reconfiguring sound. The MC is not simply entertaining, she is narrating the conditions, interpreting reality, and giving voice to communities that are often ignored in formal political discourse. Breakdancing transforms physical space into performance space. Graffiti turns public infrastructure into canvas. Each element, the four elements of hip-hop, reclaim space, sonic, physical, and visual creativity. And this is where the continuity becomes clear. Hip-hop is not disconnected from earlier traditions. It is a continuation of them all. It carries forward the same cultural logics that shape the spirituals, the blues, and jazz: collective participation, improvisation, and the transformation of constraint into expression. But at the same time, it represents change because hip-hop scales. What begins in local neighborhoods becomes national, then transnational, global. It becomes an industry, it becomes a language spoken across borders. And in doing so, it carries with it not just style, but perspective. It critiques policing, it critiques poverty, it critiques power, and even when it becomes commercialized, those tensions remain embedded within it. So hip-hop is not simply music, it's a historical evidence. It's evidence of how communities respond to structural inequality and neglect, evidence of how culture can function as both expression and analysis, and evidence that even in conditions of neglect, creativity does not disappear. It emerges, it transforms. It asserts itself through power and sound. If hip-hop can show us how the past is carried forward into the present, then Afrofuturism asks a different question. What happens when we refuse to let the past limit the future? Because throughout this history, Black identity has often been defined through struggle, through slavery, through segregation and inequality. Now, Afrofuturism does not ignore that history, but it refuses to be confined or identified by it. Instead, it repositions sui generis Blackness within futures that have historically excluded it. This is not just about representation, it's about imagination as a form of power. In literature, music, and visual culture, Afrofuturism blends technology, scientific fiction, and African diasporic traditions to create new narratives. It asks, what would it look like to exist in a future where Black people are not reacting to systems of oppression, not informed by systems of oppression, by conditions of horrific racism and white supremacy, but shaping worlds on their own terms? And this is where figures like Nichelle Nichols become historically significant, because her presence on Star Trek is not symbolic. It places a Black woman in a role associated with technology, exploration, authority, imagination, and creativity at a time when those spaces were largely inaccessible. It expands the boundaries of what audiences can imagine, not just about the future, but about who belongs in it. Afrofuturism goes beyond a single figure. It's a framework. It's the idea that the future can be rewritten, that history does not determine destiny, and that imagination itself is a site of resistance. And that is where Wakanda comes in, a reimagining of space and time, where Blackness can live and thrive. So when we step back and look at Unit 4 as a whole, a pattern emerges. Each phase builds upon the one before it. Cultural expression changes identity, political movements challenge power, and by the end, both converge in something deeper. The ability not just to respond to the world, but to reimagine it. Because if earlier movements were about gaining access and later movements were about redefining identity, then this final phase is about something even more expansive. It's about defining the future. I'm Dr. Kamasi Hill, and this has been a Griot's History. And always remember, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the story alive.